For decades, the name Kitty Genovese has been synonymous with the darkest corners of human apathy. You know the story, right? Her tragic end became a parable for modern city life. It's this chilling reminder of how alone we truly are, even when we're surrounded by millions of other people. For a long time, we've been taught that her death was a spectacle of absolute indifference, a horrifying theater where dozens of ordinary, everyday citizens just simply chose to look away. For 60 years, the world believed 38 people watched a woman die and did nothing. Almost none of it was true. In this explainer, we're going to untangle the deeply ingrained myth from the tragic reality. We're going to separate the actual, verified events of Kitty Genovese's murder from a fabricated media narrative. It was a narrative so powerful, it literally built an entire foundational field of modern psychology on a lie.
It began just before 4 in the morning in a quiet Queens neighborhood called Kew Gardens.
The date was March 13th, 1964. 28-year-old Kitty Genovese was driving home. She worked nights, managing a local bar, and her shift had ended around 2:30. As she pulled into the parking lot near her apartment building, she caught the attention of a man named Winston Mosley. Mosley had been cruising the empty, cold streets in a white Corvair, specifically hunting for a victim. Armed with a hunting knife, he followed her on foot. As Kitty walked toward her front door, Mosley closed the distance, lunging at her and striking twice in the back. She cried out, her screams piercing the quiet night. A neighbor's voice from a window did what nobody else could. High above the street, a resident named Robert Moser was actually roused by the commotion. He leaned out his window, saw the struggle below, and shouted down into the darkness, "Let that girl alone!" Startled by the sudden intervention, Mosley panicked. He abandoned his attack right then and there and fled the scene into the shadows. In the terrifying silence that followed, Kitty was left alone on the pavement, severely bleeding. Driven by sheer survival instinct, she somehow managed to pull herself up and stagger away from the open street. She made her way around the side of her building, seeking refuge in a narrow, enclosed hallway at the rear of her neighbor's apartment block. It was a desperate attempt to find safety, but tragically, this very action took her completely out of the sightline of anyone looking down from the windows above. She was now entirely hidden from the street. The attacker came back, and this time, nobody heard the second attack begin. After waiting in his car and realizing the police hadn't arrived, Mosley returned to the scene. He searched the area, eventually finding Kitty collapsed in that hidden rear vestibule. Because they were indoors, completely out of sight from the street, this final, fatal assault went largely unnoticed by the sleeping neighborhood. But the idea that she died completely alone, completely abandoned by humanity, that is completely false. A neighbor named Sophia Farrar, a 70-year-old woman, actually heard the muffled cries from her apartment. Without hesitation and not even knowing if a killer was still lurking in the hallway, Farrar rushed down the stairs. She found Kitty on the floor. Farrar sat on the cold tile, cradled the dying young woman in her arms, and held her until the ambulance arrived. Kitty Genovese did not die alone on a cold sidewalk while her neighbors just watched. She died in the arms of a friend who risked her own life to help. 2 weeks later, a newspaper turned a tragedy into a verdict on an entire city. On March 27, 1964, the New York Times published a front-page story that would literally echo through history. The headline was staggering. It read, "37 who saw murder didn't call the police." The article, which later revised that number up to 38, claimed that 36 respectable, law-abiding citizens had watched the killing unfold from their windows for over 30 minutes, completely paralyzed by apathy. The story aggressively insisted that not a single one of these 38 people picked up a telephone to call the police during the assault. The impact of this article was explosive. Pushed forward by the Times' powerful city editor, Abe Rosenthal, the story absolutely horrified the American public. It fed directly into this growing, nationwide anxiety about urban decay, alienation, and the moral bankruptcy of modern society. The reactions were swift and overwhelming. Sermons were preached about these 38 witnesses, books were written, and television segments fiercely debated the decaying soul of the American city. That number, 38, became a symbol of a society that had completely lost its basic humanity. That single article created a psychological theory that's taught to this day. Reacting directly to that New York Times story, 2 psychologists, John Darley and Bip Latane, were deeply troubled by the concept of 38 people doing absolutely nothing. So they designed a series of experiments to try and understand this collective inaction. What they developed became famously known as the bystander effect. The theory proposed a diffusion of responsibility. Basically, it's the idea that the more people who witness an emergency, the less likely any single individual is to intervene, because everyone just assumes someone else will take action. Now, this academic theory was profound, and it fundamentally changed how we understand crowd psychology. But its entire origin story was rooted in the unquestioned acceptance of the Kitty Genovese media narrative. Almost overnight, every psychology textbook in the country began to feature the story of the 38 silent witnesses. It was presented as the ultimate undeniable proof of human detachment. It became an undisputed fact of modern history.
Decades later, journalists and Kitty's own brother went back and asked a simple question: did any of this actually happen the way it was reported?
Well, when you compare the myth to the reality, the official narrative completely collapses. Kitty's brother, Bill Genovese, spent years meticulously tracking down the surviving neighbors and combing through police records. The truth he found was startlingly different. For starters, there were never 38 eyewitnesses who watched the murder. Because the attacks happened in two different locations, remember the second one was indoors, almost no one saw the attack in its entirety. Most people only heard brief random shouts, naturally assuming it was just a drunken argument spilling out from a local bar. And crucially, people actually did act. Robert Mosers shouted and scared the attacker away. Sophia Fair rushed to Kitty's side. And official records show that neighbors actually did call the police, but those calls were either mishandled by operators or completely ignored in the original press reports. As the layers of the myth were peeled back, a much darker reality regarding the criminal justice system started to emerge. When Winston Moseley was finally arrested, he not only gave a highly detailed confession to Kitty Genovese's murder, he also confessed to the murders of two other women, Annie Mae Johnson and Barbara Kralik. But shockingly, the police actively buried Moseley's confessions to these other crimes. Why? Because detectives had already coerced false, highly detailed confessions out of two innocent, vulnerable teenagers, 18-year-old Alvin Mitchell and 19-year-old George Whitmore. They did this through brutal interrogations and psychological abuse. The police were protecting their own flawed investigations. They chose to let a serial killer's full truth remain hidden rather than admit they had framed innocent boys. The true tragedy of Kitty Genovese is multifaceted. It is a heartbreaking story of a brutal murder, yes, but it is also a story of severe police misconduct, false confessions, and a willing press that prioritized a sensational narrative over factual reporting. We really have to ask ourselves, why did this specific myth take such deep root in our collective consciousness? The bystander effect is real. The story that made it famous was mostly fiction. We clung to the myth of the 38 witnesses because, in a strange, somewhat twisted way, it offered a clean, understandable explanation for an unfathomably chaotic and terrifying event.
If you look back at our earlier explainers, you'll see a pattern. The same psychological forces that let the fatal cracks in the Rana Plaza factory go ignored, the same institutional blindness that allowed the Challenger space shuttle to launch despite clear warnings, these are the exact same forces that compel us to blindly accept a media myth. We have a profound, sometimes dangerous need to bend the truth to fit comfortable, simple explanations for complex human failure. The story of 38 heartless witnesses gave society a convenient scapegoat. It allowed us to avoid looking at the much messier realities of systemic police coercion, inadequate emergency response systems, and the terrifying random nature of violence.
By stripping away the myth, we restore Kitty Genovese's humanity. And we honor the genuine bravery of the neighbors who did, in fact, try to help her in the dark. It leaves us with a chilling final thought. If an entire society can be so easily convinced to believe the worst about human nature, what other comfortable lies are we still blindly accepting today? Thank you for watching Dark Chronicles. Real stories, verified sources. Follow for more.